Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet, heavy, and just a little bit unsettling. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe lie back. Let your brain slow down a bit. Because tonight, we're heading into the humid jungles of ancient Mesoamerica where giant stone heads sit in silence and have been doing so for thousands of years with absolutely no interest in explaining themselves. And honestly, fair enough. These are the Olmec Colossal Heads. Massive, human,
Calm.
slightly judgmental, and as far as history is concerned, deeply mysterious. No dramatic backstory carved beside them. No helpful ancient plaque saying, built by King so-and-so, who had excellent cheekbones. Just heads. Huge ones. Let's ease into it. Somewhere around 1200 BC, long before the more famous civilizations showed up to take the spotlight, there was a culture living along the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico. We call them the Olmec, not because that's what they called themselves, but because history is like that sometimes. It loses names, keeps the confusion. The Olmec didn't leave behind readable writing we can confidently translate. So instead, they left vibes.
And stone.
A lot of stone. And among all their carvings, altars, and sculptures, the most famous, the most quietly intimidating, are the colossal heads. There are about 17 of them that we know of, each one carved from a single block of basalt. Each one weighing somewhere between 6 and 50 tons, which is already a bit excessive. Like, if you're making a face, you could probably stop at, say, not 50 tons.
But no.
They committed. Now, imagine this. You're standing in a thick, humid jungle. Birds are making distant, slightly eerie noises. The air feels heavy. Everything smells like damp earth and leaves. And then through the trees you see a face. A human face.
Calm. Round.
Almost thoughtful. But also enormous. Several meters tall. Just sitting there. Not attached to a body. Because apparently bodies were optional. It's the kind of thing that doesn't jump out at you. It just settles into your awareness and stays there. Each head is unique. Different facial features, different expressions, different helmet-like headgear. Some look slightly annoyed. Some look tired. Some look like they've just accepted that this is their life now, being a giant stone head in a swamp. And honestly, same. The helmets are especially interesting. They don't look decorative. They look practical, like something worn for protection, or maybe for a game, or a ritual, or, if we're being mildly dramatic, ancient Mesoamerican sports gear. Because yes, there's a theory that these heads might represent ball players, which is somehow both reasonable and completely bizarre. Imagine being so good at a game that they carve your face into a 20-ton rock. No pressure. But the more widely accepted idea is that these heads represent rulers. Important individuals. Leaders. Which makes sense. Because if you're in charge and you have access to massive stones and a workforce that can somehow move them across miles of jungle, you might at some point think, you know what I need? A giant version of my face. For reasons. And no one says no. Because of course they don't. Now, let's talk about the logistics. Because this is where things get quietly ridiculous. The basalt used to carve these heads didn't come from where the heads were found. It came from mountains. Sometimes over 50 miles away. Through dense jungle. Across rivers. With no metal tools. No wheels. No large domesticated animals to help.
Just people.
and determination, and probably a lot of sighing. So picture this slow, almost surreal scene. Hundreds of workers, pulling, lifting, dragging a massive stone block, day after day, week after week, through mud, through heat, through insects that absolutely did not respect personal space, all to move a rock that will eventually become a face, a very large face, and not even their own, which feels like a lot of effort for someone else's cheekbones. Once the stone arrived, it had to be carved, carefully shaped, smoothed, detailed, without metal tools, just stone tools, which is impressive and slightly exhausting to think about. Every curve of the lips, every line around the eyes, all done slowly,
Patiently.
no shortcuts, no undo button, just commitment. And here's the part that makes everything just a little more interesting. The heads don't all stay where they were originally placed. Some were moved, repositioned, even buried at different times. Almost like later generations didn't quite know what to do with them either, which is oddly relatable. There's something about these faces. They're not idealized in the way later sculptures often are. They don't look like perfect, distant gods. They look human, heavy-lidded eyes, broad noses, full lips. There's personality there, subtle but present. It's like each one is quietly thinking something and just choosing not to share it. And, of course, because humans are humans, theories started showing up. Some reasonable, some less so. There were early ideas suggesting connections to distant continents, because people saw the features and thought, this must mean something global, which says more about modern assumptions than ancient reality. Most scholars today agree these heads are distinctly local, part of the Olmec world, not visitors, not outsiders,
Just people.
important people, immortalized in stone. Still, the mystery lingers, because we don't have names. We don't have stories attached to each face. We don't know exactly who they were, or what they thought, or whether they liked the final result. Imagine being a ruler. You commission a massive stone head of yourself. It takes months, maybe years. And at the end, you look at it and think, I mean, it's fine. No revisions, no feedback, just permanent stone face. Let's float gently over to something slightly more human. Because behind all this stone there were people. Rulers, yes, but also individuals living in a complex society. The Olmec world wasn't simple. They had cities, ceremonial centers, trade networks,
Art.
rituals, and like most early civilizations, a strong connection to the natural world. Everything had meaning. Mountains, rivers, animals, possibly even the act of carving itself. Turning raw stone into a human face might have been more than art. It might have been transformation. There's also a quiet emotional weight to these heads. They endure, long after the people who made them are gone, long after the language is lost, long after the reasons fade. They just remain, watching, not actively, of course, but it feels like it. And maybe that's part of why they're so compelling. They don't explain themselves. They don't guide you toward a neat conclusion. They just sit there, letting you wonder, which for humans is both fascinating and mildly frustrating, because we like answers. We like neat stories, beginnings, middles, ends. The Olmec heads offer none of that. just presence. Some of the heads show signs of damage, chips, erosion,
wear,
time doing what time does, slowly softening everything. But even with that, they hold their shape, their expressions, their quiet, slightly detached dignity. And here's a small, slightly amusing thought. At some point, someone in the Olmec world had to stand back, look at one of these finished heads, and feel something. Pride, maybe, relief, or just tired. Like, well, that's done. Let's never move another 40-ton rock again. Of course, they probably did, because history has a way of repeating effort. As we settle into the rhythm of this story, it becomes less about solving the mystery and more about sitting with it, letting it be unclear, letting these faces remain just a little out of reach, because not everything from the past wants to be fully understood. Some things just exist quietly, patiently, waiting for us to notice them. And tonight we have. Just a little. We've stepped into their world, felt the weight of the stone, the slow movement of time, the quiet persistence of human effort. In the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the lives behind the faces, the possible rulers, the strange, subtle power structures, and the slightly odd choices that come with being important enough to become a giant head. Because, as it turns out, being remembered forever is not always as glamorous as it sounds, especially when you don't get to keep the rest of your body. For now, just let those faces sit in your mind.
still,
Heavy, unbothered, and very, very patient. Hey guys, let's ease back in. No rush. The jungle is still there. Quiet, humid, patient. And those enormous stone faces still sitting exactly where we left them. Not moving, not blinking, not explaining anything. Just existing with confidence. So let's drift a little closer to the people behind these heads. Or, at least, the people we think might be behind them. Because if there's one thing the Olmec culture does consistently, it's leaving just enough clues to be interesting, and not quite enough to be certain. Which is honestly a bold long-term strategy. Most scholars believe these colossal heads represent rulers, leaders of Olmec cities, men who had power, influence, and apparently access to a truly impressive stone budget. Each head looks different, and not in a generic way. These aren't copy-paste royal portraits where everyone looks like the same slightly bored cousin. No, these faces have individuality, specific features, distinct expressions, which strongly suggests these were real people, actual individuals, not gods, not mythical beings, just humans, important ones. Now imagine being one of these rulers. You live in a world where your authority isn't just political, it's probably spiritual too. You're not just the guy in charge. You're a central figure in rituals, ceremonies, maybe even seen as a kind of bridge between humans and whatever forces people believed were shaping their world. No pressure. And in that position, you might want to leave something behind. Something lasting. Something that says, quietly but firmly, I was here. I mattered. Also, please admire my jawline. And so the colossal head becomes a thing. But here's where it gets a little gently strange. Because these heads aren't smiling. They're not triumphant. They're not even particularly dramatic. They're calm, almost serious. A bit heavy, emotionally. Like someone who has accepted a lot and is no longer interested in small talk. Some have slightly downer mouths. Others have eyes that feel tired. Not exhausted exactly, just aware, which is an odd vibe to carve into a 30-ton rock. It's not, look how powerful I am. It's more like, yes, I am in charge. It's the lot. Let's float over to those helmets again, because they keep showing up. Every head wears one. Snug-fitting, thick-looking, almost padded, and they vary in detail.
Some have bands.
Some have what look like straps or decorations. But overall, they don't scream fashion. They whisper function. There's a theory these helmets are related to the Mesoamerican ball game, which, if you're picturing something casual and recreational, gently adjust that thought. This wasn't weekend football. This was ritual, symbolic, sometimes tied to ideas of life, death, and cosmic balance. Just a normal game with existential stakes. So if these rulers are shown wearing ball game gear, that might mean something. Maybe they participated. Maybe they sponsored the games. Maybe the helmet itself became a symbol of status, power, or ritual importance. Or maybe it was just what leaders wore, like a uniform, a very specific, very padded uniform. Now, let's imagine the emotional side of all this, because behind the stone there were lives. And being a ruler in an early civilization was not exactly a relaxing job. There's no vacation policy, no out-of-office message, no quiet weekend where you just unplug. You're managing people, resources, ritual expectations, possibly dealing with droughts, floods, or crops that suddenly decide they're not in the mood. And every problem somehow circles back to you, because of course it does. So maybe those slightly heavy expressions on the heads aren't accidental. Maybe they reflect something real. The weight of responsibility, the quiet stress of always being the one. And then there's legacy, that persistent human urge to be remembered, to leave something behind that says, I existed. Today we do it with photos, videos, social media posts that quietly drift into digital oblivion. The Olmec? They went with basalt. Large, immovable basalt. Because if you're going to be remembered, you might as well make it difficult to ignore. But here's where things take a slightly unexpected turn. Some of these heads were deliberately damaged.
Not by time.
Not by weather. By people. Noses chipped. Features defaced. Sometimes quite intentionally. Which raises a calm but slightly awkward question.
Why?
One possibility is that when a ruler died or lost power, their image lost its importance, or even became inconvenient. And rather than gently storing the sculpture somewhere, people altered it, reduced its presence, quietly but firmly. It's a bit like ancient reputation management. Except instead of deleting posts, you're chipping away at a 20-ton face. Slowly, patiently, with purpose. Another idea is that later generations had different beliefs, different priorities, and these old monuments didn't quite fit anymore. So they were reworked,
Moved. Buried.
not destroyed entirely, just adjusted. Like someone redecorating a very old, very heavy living room. And then there's the possibility that these acts were ritual, symbolic, part of a cycle we don't fully understand. Because once again, the Olmec are not here to clarify. They left the stones. They kept the explanations. Let's drift for a moment into the process again, because it really is quietly extreme. Carving one of these heads would take an incredible amount of time, effort, coordination. It wasn't a casual project. It was a commitment. a long-term investment in someone's face. And that means the decision to make one mattered. This wasn't done for everyone. Not every leader gets a giant stone portrait. So whoever these individuals were, they were significant, even within a system already built on hierarchy. And yet, despite all that importance, we don't know their names. Not with certainty. Not in a way we can confidently say, this is him. Or, this is his story. It's a strange kind of anonymity. To be immortalized and still unknown. Recognized but not identified. Seen but not understood. And there's something oddly peaceful about that. Because in a world where everything is labeled, categorized, explained, these faces just resist that. They exist without context, without captions, without commentary. And maybe that's why they feel so calm. They're not trying to prove anything anymore. They've done their part. They've outlasted their creators, their culture, their moment in history. Now they just sit in fields, in museums, in reconstructed sites, still heavy, still quiet, still slightly unreadable. Let's gently shift toward one more small detail, the scale. Because it's easy to say they're big and move on. But standing next to one is different. You don't just see it. You feel it. The size, the weight, the presence. It changes the way you stand, the way you look, even the way you think, just a little. It's not intimidating in a dramatic way. It's not trying to scare you. It's just undeniably there.
Solid.
Unmoving. Patient. And in that moment you become the temporary one. The passing thing. While this feast continues. Which is in a very calm, slightly humbling way. The entire point. So as we slowly move forward into the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the Olmec world itself. The cities. The rituals. The quiet systems that made all of this possible. Because giant stone heads don't just appear. They come from somewhere. From people. From choices. From a culture that, despite everything we don't know, was clearly capable of remarkable things. For now, just let the silence sit. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that feels complete on its own. And those faces, still watching, still waiting, still saying absolutely nothing at all. Not every leader gets a giant stone portrait. So whoever these individuals were, they were significant, even within a system already built on hierarchy. And yet, despite all that importance, we don't know their names. Not with certainty. Not in a way we can confidently say, this is him. Or, this is his story. It's a strange kind of anonymity. To be immortalized and still unknown. Recognized but not identified. Seen but not understood. And there's something oddly peaceful about that. Because in a world where everything is labeled, categorized, explained, these faces just resist that. They exist without context, without captions, without commentary. And maybe that's why they feel so calm. They're not trying to prove anything anymore. They've done their part. They've outlasted their creators, their culture, their moment in history. Now they just sit in fields, in museums, in reconstructed sites, still heavy, still quiet, still slightly unreadable. Let's gently shift toward one more small detail, the scale. Because it's easy to say they're big and move on. But standing next to one is different. You don't just see it. You feel it. The size, the weight, the presence. It changes the way you stand, the way you look, even the way you think, just a little. It's not intimidating in a dramatic way. It's not trying to scare you. It's just undeniably there.
Solid.
Unmoving. Patient. And in that moment, you become the temporary one. The passing thing. While this feast continues, which is in a very calm, slightly humbling way, the entire point. So as we slowly move forward into the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the Olmec world itself. The cities, the rituals, the quiet systems that made all of this possible. Because giant stone heads don't just appear. They come from somewhere, from people, from choices, from a culture that, despite everything we don't know, was clearly capable of remarkable things. For now, just let the silence sit. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that feels complete on its own. And those faces, still watching, still waiting, still saying absolutely nothing at all. Hey guys, welcome back. No sudden movements. We're still in that same soft, humid world where the air feels thick and time moves just a little slower than usual. Those stone faces are still there. Of course they are. They're not going anywhere. But tonight, we're not going to stare at them directly. That would be too easy. Instead, we're going to drift outward a bit, into the world that made them possible. Because giant stone heads don't just happen. They require a society that can organize, plan, believe, and commit to something that takes years, just to produce one very large, very calm face. The Olmec lived along the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico, a landscape of rivers, swamps, dense forests, and soil that could be both generous and unpredictable. It wasn't an easy place to live, which makes what they built quietly impressive. Their major centers included places we now call San Lorenzo and La Venta. Again, not their original names. Just the labels we've gently assigned, because history doesn't always keep its receipts. San Lorenzo was one of the earliest. A city that rose, expanded, and for a time, thrived. It had platforms, plazas, drainage systems, and signs of careful planning, which is always a little surprising when you imagine ancient life as spontaneous and loosely organized. It wasn't. It rarely is. People lived there, worked there, raised families, grew food, participated in rituals, dealt with daily inconveniences like mud insects and probably neighbors who had opinions. Because no civilization, no matter how early, escapes that. And somewhere within this structured, slightly messy human world, decisions were made. Big ones. Like, yes, we're going to move a multi-ton stone across miles of jungle. And everyone else just adjusted accordingly. That kind of project requires more than strength. It requires coordination, leadership, planning, and perhaps most importantly, a shared belief that this effort is worth it. Which brings us gently to the Olmec worldview. Because whatever they believed, it mattered enough to shape landscapes, to move stone, to carve faces that would outlast them. The Olmec are often described as one of the mother cultures of Mesoamerica, which sounds very official and slightly dramatic. But what it really means is that many ideas, styles, and practices that appear later in civilizations like the Maya or the Aztecs seem to have early roots here.
Art.
Symbolism. Ritual practices. Even early writing systems possibly. Though, as always, things are just unclear enough to keep everyone politely debating. Olmec art is distinctive. Not just the colossal heads, but smaller carvings too. Figures that blend human and animal features, especially jaguars. Because of course, they chose one of the most powerful, slightly intimidating animals in the region. There's a recurring image, sometimes called the word jaguar. A figure with human characteristics, but also feline traits. Downturned mouth, almond-shaped eyes, a look that is both calm and slightly otherworldly. It shows up again and again, which suggests it meant something important, something symbolic, possibly tied to beliefs about transformation,
Power.
or the connection between humans and the natural world. And in that context, carving a human face into stone might not just be about memory. It might be about identity, about capturing something essential, something that goes beyond the physical. Let's drift back to the cities for a moment, because San Lorenzo didn't last forever. Around 900 BC, it declined. Quietly, as far as we can tell. No dramatic final battle. No cinematic collapse. Just a gradual shift. And then La Venta rises. Another center. Another place of activity, ritual, and careful construction. It becomes the new focus. The new somewhere important, which is a pattern we see again and again in history. Places rise. Places fall. People move. Focus shifts. And whatever was once central becomes background. Some of the colossal heads are associated with these sites, placed in specific locations, possibly arranged with intention, aligned in ways we don't fully understand. Because of course we don't. There's a quiet possibility that these heads weren't just portraits. They might have been part of something larger. Ceremonial spaces, public displays, markers of power, or even guardians of important areas. Not in a dramatic, supernatural sense, just symbolic presence. A reminder of who was in charge, of what mattered, of the structure of the world around them. And then over time, things change. Again, La Venta, too, eventually declines. The centers fade. The structures are left. Some are buried. Some are abandoned. Some are repurposed. And the heads
Stay.
They don't pack up and move. They don't adapt. They don't evolve. They just remain where they were placed or where they were moved later. It's a strange kind of stillness. In a world that was clearly active, dynamic, constantly shifting, these faces become fixed points, unchanging, while everything else moves on. Let's gently consider the people again, because behind every structure, every carving, every decision, there were individuals, workers who dragged stone, shapes, patterns, clues. It's like walking into a room long after a conversation has ended.
You can see where people sat.
You can sense that something happened, but the words themselves are missing, and yet the room still feels full. That's the Olmec world. Not empty, not silent, just incomplete in a very human way. Let's float, gently, toward one last thought for tonight. Because there's something quietly humbling about all of this. The effort, the scale, the intention, all of it was meant to matter,
To last. To be seen.
and in a way it worked.
We're here.
Noticing, thinking about them, trying gently to understand, but not completely. Never completely. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the purpose wasn't to be fully understood thousands of years later. Maybe it was just to exist in their time, for their people, in their world, and the rest is just what we do. trying to piece together something whole from fragments that were never meant to survive this long. In the next part, we'll drift into the quieter theories, the subtle debates, the things scholars gently argue about, while trying to remain calm and professional. Things like, why only heads? Why this size? Why this style? And, of course, the slightly uncomfortable realization that sometimes we might be asking questions that the past never intended to answer. For now, just rest in the stillness, the slow rhythm of a world that once moved quickly and now barely moves at all. Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in again. No need to rush. By now, the jungle probably feels familiar. The air is still warm, the ground still a little damp, and those enormous stone faces still doing absolutely nothing, which, honestly, they're very committed to. Tonight, we drift into the softer territory. The questions, not the loud, dramatic ones, just the quiet, slightly persistent thoughts that show up when you sit with something long enough. Like this one, why only heads? It's such a simple question, and also strangely difficult, because when humans make statues, we usually go for the whole thing. Head, body, maybe a dramatic pose if we're feeling ambitious. The Olmec? They stopped at the neck and called it a day. No torsos, no arms, no carefully sculpted royal stance, just head. Large, detailed, unmistakably human head. One possibility is practical. Bodies are complicated. More stone, more time, more effort. And if your goal is recognition, the face is enough. It's the most human part of us. The part we remember, the part we look for. So maybe they focused on what mattered most. Identity, expression, presence. But there's another possibility, a quieter one. In many cultures, the head is more than just anatomy. It's the seat of thought, of spirit, of identity itself. So carving just the head might not be incomplete. It might be intentional, a way of capturing the essence of a person without everything else, which, in a calm, slightly philosophical way, makes these sculptures feel less like portraits and more like distilled people. Let's gently move to another question. Why this size? Because again, they didn't go small. They didn't go medium. They went undeniably large. You don't accidentally make a 30-ton sculpture. That's a decision. A very deliberate one. Size, of course, is power. Visibility. Impact. A giant face isn't just seen. It's felt. It changes how you move around it, how you think about the person it represents. If you're standing next to something that big, you don't feel equal to it. And maybe that was the point. A quiet reinforcement of hierarchy, of importance, of this person matters more than you. But expressed very calmly, very slowly, through stone. There's also the possibility that size had a ritual meaning, something symbolic, something tied to beliefs we don't fully understand. Because once again, the Olmec left the art and took the explanations with them. Let's float over to style, because these faces, while realistic, are also consistent. Broad features, heavy eyelids, full lips, strong, rounded forms. It's not random. It's a shared aesthetic, a way of seeing and representing the human face. And that tells us something subtle. The Olmec weren't just copying reality. They were interpreting it, shaping it, choosing what to emphasize. which means these heads are not just records. They're decisions, artistic ones, cultural ones, and every decision reflects a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world. Now let's gently drift into something a little more uncertain. The theories, not the wild, dramatic ones. We'll leave those quietly in the corner, where they can rest. Instead, the softer debates. The ones scholars return to again and again with slightly different wording each time. One idea is that the heads were arranged in specific ways, facing certain directions, placed in relation to other structures, possibly aligned with ceremonies, with processions, with gatherings. Imagine a space where people come together, rituals unfolding, movement, sound, rhythm, and around them these massive, silent faces, watching, not actively but symbolically, a presence that reinforces the importance of the moment, the continuity of leadership, the connection to those who came before. Another idea is that the heads marked territories, important places, boundaries, not in a defensive sense, more like a statement, a quiet, immovable sign that says, "This place matters," and someone important is connected to it. There's also the possibility that some heads were carved from earlier monuments, reworked, reshaped, given new meaning, which is a very human thing to do, taking what already exists and adapting it, reinterpreting it. And if that's true, it adds another layer. These heads aren't just about individuals. They're about time,
change, continuity.
Now, let's pause just briefly on something slightly ironic. For all the effort, all the scale, all the intention, we're still not entirely sure what they were for. And that's not a failure. It's just the nature of history, especially very old history. Not everything survives. Not every explanation makes it through. Sometimes all that remains is the result, not the reason. And we, being who we are, try to fill in the gaps.
Carefully,
thoughtfully, but still with guesswork. Which brings us to a slightly uncomfortable, but very gentle realization. Some of our questions might not have mattered to the Olmec. They weren't thinking about future archaeologists, or documentaries, or sleepy YouTube videos. They were thinking about their own world, their own beliefs, their own needs, and whatever purpose these had served, it made sense to them, completely, even if it doesn't fully make sense to us. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of mystery itself, because these heads have become symbols of it. Not dramatic mystery, not hidden treasure or lost secrets, just quiet uncertainty, the kind that doesn't demand an answer, the kind that just exists. And there's something oddly comforting about that. In a world where we're used to instant explanations, search results, clear conclusions, these faces offer none of that. They ask us to sit with not knowing, to observe without resolving, which is not something we do often. And maybe that's part of their lasting power. Not just their size, not just their age, but their refusal to explain themselves. They don't guide us. They don't narrate. They don't clarify. They just remain. So as we slowly move toward the next part, we'll begin to soften the edges even more. Less about what we can figure out, more about what it feels like to encounter something that resists understanding. Because sometimes, history isn't a story to solve. It's a presence to sit with. And these faces, quiet, massive, and endlessly patient,
are very good at that.
for now, just let the questions rest. No need to answer them. They've been waiting this long. They can wait a little longer. Hey guys, welcome back. Everything is a little quieter now. Not because anything has changed suddenly, but because we've been sitting here long enough for the noise to fade on its own. The jungle feels softer. The air feels heavier, but in a calm way. And those stone faces, still there. Of course. Tonight, we're not adding anything new. No big revelations. No dramatic shifts. Just a slow drift into what happens when a world doesn't end all at once, but simply stops being what it was. Because the Olmec didn't collapse in a single moment. There's no clean ending. No final scene. No last ruler dramatically staring into the distance as everything falls apart. Instead, things change. Gradually. Quietly. Almost politely. San Lorenzo fades. La Venta rises, and then it, too, softens. Other centers appear. Different regions become more active. And what we call Olmec culture doesn't vanish. It just blends. Ideas continue. Styles continue. Practices shift, but don't disappear. It's less like a door closing, and more like a conversation that slowly drifts into something else, until you realize you're no longer talking about the same thing. And in all of that, the heads remain. They don't follow the people. They don't adapt to new beliefs. They don't adjust their meaning. They just sit, which creates a quiet contrast. A moving world and unmoving faces. Imagine returning to a place years later, somewhere that used to matter. The buildings are worn. The layout feels familiar, but distant. And they're in the same spot. Is something unchanged. Not active. Not relevant in the same way. But still present. That's what these heads become. Not central. Not forgotten either. Just there. Let's gently think about the people who came after. Because they didn't arrive in an empty world. They inherited landscapes, structures, objects that already existed. And among those objects were these massive stone faces. Now imagine encountering one without knowing its original purpose. You see a giant head, carefully carved, clearly important at some point, but the story behind it? Unclear. So what do? Maybe you create new meanings, new explanations, new connections, because humans are very good at that. We don't like gaps. We fill them, sometimes with careful thought, sometimes with creative confidence. So it's entirely possible that, even in ancient times, these heads had multiple lives, first as representations of rulers, then as something else, symbols, markers, relics of a past that was already becoming distant. Which is a slightly strange idea, that something can become ancient even to people who lived long ago. Time doesn't just pass for us. It passed for them too. They also had the past. They also looked at older things and wondered. And in that quiet overlap, we're not so different. Let's drift for a moment into the physical landscape again. Because nature doesn't pause. Rain falls. Rivers shift. Plants grow and grow and grow. Over time, some of these heads became partially buried, covered by earth, surrounded by roots, hidden not intentionally but inevitably, not lost, just absorbed into the environment, which is a very calm kind of disappearance. No drama. No sudden vanishing, just a slow blending into the ground itself, until one day, they're no longer part of daily life. Not destroyed, not removed, just no longer seen. And that might have been how they stayed for a long time, quiet,
Covered.
waiting without really waiting. Because time for stone doesn't work the same way it does for us. Centuries pass, then more again, and eventually much later, people begin to notice them again. Not the same people, not the same culture, different languages, different beliefs, different questions, but the same faces, still there, still calm, still refusing to explain anything. And now the meaning shifts again, from active symbol to ancient artifact, from something used to something studied. And that shift is quietly profound, because it changes the relationship entirely. The Olmec didn't look at these heads and think, what can we learn from this object? They looked at them and thought, this is part of our world.
But now,
We stand in front of them and try to understand. Different role, different mindset, same object. And there's something slightly humbling about that. Because no matter how much we study, measure, analyze, there's always a distance, a gap between what something meant and what we think it meant, and that gap never fully closes. Let's gently settle into that idea for a moment, not as a problem, not as frustration, just as part of the experience, because these heads are not puzzles to solve. Not entirely. They're remnants, pieces of a larger whole that doesn't exist anymore. And maybe the goal isn't to reconstruct everything perfectly. Maybe it's just to notice, to sit with what remains, to appreciate the effort, the scale, the quiet intention behind it, without needing to fully resolve it. Now, one last soft thought before we drift onward. At some point, someone saw one of these heads for the last time, before it disappeared from everyday awareness. No ceremony, no announcement, just a moment, a glance, a passing thought, and then life continued, and the head stayed, unchanged. There's something deeply human in that. The way important things slowly become background. The way presence fades into familiarity and then into absence. And the way sometimes what lasts the longest is not what we expect. In the next part, we'll move gently into the rediscovery. Not dramatic, not sudden. Hey guys, welcome back. Take a second to settle in again. By now, everything feels a little slower. The kind of slow that doesn't ask anything from you. Just stay here for a bit. Because tonight, we're not going forward in the usual way. We're gently looping back, not to the Olmec themselves, but to the moment when these faces quietly re-entered the human conversation. Not with a dramatic reveal. No cinematic music swelling in the background. Just people noticing things. Over time, locals living in these regions had always known something was there. Large shapes, unusual stones, forms that didn't quite belong to the natural landscape. But knowing something is there and understanding what it is are two very different things. So for a long time, these heads existed in a kind of quiet in-between, seen but not fully recognized. Present, but not fully interpreted. And then, gradually more attention arrives. Explorers, researchers, archaeologists, people who look at a massive carved stone face and think, this seems like something we should probably study. Which is a fair reaction. One of the earliest widely noted discoveries happened in the 19th century. A large stone head, partially buried, quietly existing in the landscape, not hidden on purpose, just covered by time. And when it was uncovered more fully, it didn't shout. It didn't announce itself. It just appeared. A face. Massive.
Calm.
Completely uninterested in explaining how it got there. And from that point on, interest grows. Slowly.
Carefully.
Because archaeology, despite what movies suggest, is not fast. It's measured. Patient. Sometimes almost stubbornly slow. Excavations happen. Surveys are done. More heads are found. And each time, the same quiet reaction. Oh, there's another one. Not identical. Not repeated.
Different.
Individual. Which is when the realization begins to settle in. These aren't random carvings. They're part of something. A system. A culture. A way of thinking that left physical traces, but very few direct explanations. And so begins the long, ongoing process of interpretation. Scholars start asking questions.
Carefully.
Who made these? When?
Why?
And for each question, answers begin to form. Tentative. Thoughtful. Sometimes revised later because new information shows up. Because that's how this works. No single moment of we figured it all out. Just gradual understanding. Layer by layer. The Olmec are identified as one of the earliest complex societies in the region. The heads are connected to them. Dated roughly between 1200 and 400 BC, which places them very early, long before many of the more widely known civilizations in the Americas. And that realization shifts perspective, because suddenly, these aren't just mysterious objects. They're evidence of organization, of artistry, of a society capable of planning, coordinating, and executing projects on a massive scale. Without metal tools, without wheels, without written explanations that survived, which is quietly impressive, and also a little humbling, because it challenges a common assumption that earlier cultures were simpler, less capable, less sophisticated. The Olmec heads suggest otherwise. They suggest complexity,
Skill.
intent, not loud, not flashy, just present. Now, as more heads are uncovered, patterns start to emerge. They're found in specific regions, near known Olmec sites, often in places that seem intentional, not randomly scattered, not accidental, placed, positioned, which reinforces the idea that they mattered deeply. And then there's the craftsmanship. Even after centuries underground, exposed to moisture, pressure, and time, the details remain. The curves of the lips, the shape of the eyes, the structure of the helmets, all still there. Not perfect, not untouched, but clearly, carefully made. And that care travels across time.
You can still see it, still feel it,
which creates a strange connection between the person who carved the stone and the person standing in front of it thousands of years later. No shared language, no shared culture, but a shared recognition of effort, of intention, and that's something that doesn't fade easily. Now, as the study continues, different interpretations come and go. Some ideas gain support, others quietly fade, because that's part of the process too. Not every theory lasts. Not every explanation holds up. And over time, a kind of balanced understanding emerges. Not complete, not final, but stable enough. These heads likely represent rulers, important individuals, part of a larger cultural and ceremonial system, carved from basalt, transported over long distances, placed with intention, and then left behind. It's not a perfect explanation, but it's a reasonable one. And sometimes that's enough. Let's gently pause on one more idea, because rediscovery doesn't just change our understanding of the past. It also says something about us. The way we approach mystery, the way we try to organize, categorize, and explain. We see something unusual, and we want to understand it, not aggressively, just naturally. And in doing so, we build narratives, connections, meanings, even when the original meanings are out of reach, which is both helpful and slightly imperfect, because every explanation we create is filtered through our own perspective, our own assumptions, our own way of seeing the world. And that means we're always a little bit outside the original story, looking in, trying carefully to make sense of something that wasn't made for us. And yet, hey guys, welcome back. No need to adjust anything. By now, you already know the pace. Slow, steady, nothing demanding your attention too sharply. Just stay where you are. We've come a long way quietly, through jungles, through time, through questions that never quite settled into answers. And those faces, still there, still exactly as they were. Tonight, there's nowhere else to go. Not forward, not deeper, just here. Because at some point, every story stops expanding. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a kind of gentle stillness. And that's where we are now. The Olmec world is gone. Not erased. Not destroyed. Just finished in the way all living systems eventually are. The cities no longer function. The rituals no longer take place. The people, their names, their voices, their daily lives have slipped beyond reach. And yet, these faces remain, not as active parts of a culture, not as symbols that still carry their original meaning, but as presence, something that exists without needing context. And that's a strange thing for us, because we like context. We like knowing what things are for. We like tidy explanations. But these heads don't offer that. They don't tell you how to interpret them. They don't guide your thoughts. They don't even ask to be understood. They just are. And maybe that's why they feel so calm. There's no urgency. No need to explain. No need to justify their existence. They've already done what they were meant to do, whatever that was. And now they continue. Let's sit with that for a moment. Imagine standing in front of one, not reading about it, not seeing a photo, but actually there. The air is warm. The ground is uneven. There's a quiet around you that feels full. And in front of you is a face, large, still, unmoving. You look at it. It doesn't look back. Not really. But there's a sense of presence, of something that has endured without effort. And in that moment, you become aware of something very simple. You will leave. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just eventually.
And it will stay.
Which is not a sad thought. Not really. Just a quiet one. A reminder of scale. Of time. Of the difference between things that pass and things that persist. And even then, The stone won't last forever. Given enough time, everything softens. Everything changes. The edges wear down. The features blur. The surface erodes. Not quickly, not noticeably, but steadily. And one day, far beyond anything we can realistically imagine, even these faces will fade. Not into nothing, but into something else. Stone returning to the earth. Shape returning to formlessness, which is, in a calm, almost comforting way, just another kind of continuation. So the story doesn't end. It just changes form, as it always does. Let's gently return to the people, because they're easy to lose in all this stone. There were individuals here. A ruler who decided a monument should be made. A group of workers who carried the stone. A sculptor who shaped the face. None of them knew how long this would last. They weren't thinking about thousands of years. They were thinking about their present, their needs, their beliefs. And yet, their actions extended far beyond that. Without intention, without planning for it, just by doing something carefully, deliberately. And that's something worth noticing, because it means lasting impact doesn't always come from trying to last. Sometimes it comes from simply doing something well, something meaningful in its own time, and letting the future do whatever it does with that, which in this case is a lot of wondering, a lot of quiet observation, and the occasional sleepy conversation like this one. Let's take one last slow look. The faces, heavy lids, calm expressions, helmets that still don't fully explain themselves. They don't feel ancient in the way ruins sometimes do. They feel present, like they've stepped slightly outside of time. Not part of the past, not part of the present, just here. And maybe that's the closest we get to understanding them. Not as objects to decode, not as puzzles to solve,
but as something to sit with.
Something to experience quietly, without needing to reach a conclusion, because not everything asks for one. And maybe that's okay. So as we slowly come to the end, there's nothing to wrap up. No final insight to deliver.
Just this.
Somewhere in a place where the air is still warm, and the ground still holds the memory of many, many years. Those faces are still there, unbothered, unexplained, and perfectly fine with both. You can leave them now. They won't mind. They've been waiting this long. They can wait a little longer. Hey guys, we're still here. No new place. No new time. Just the same quiet space we've been sitting in. By now, the story has already done what it needed to do. Not by explaining everything. Not by solving the mystery. But by slowing things down. And that's kind of rare. Because most stories want to move. They want to go somewhere. Build towards something. End with something clear. This one didn't. And that's okay. The Olmec heads are still out there. In fields. In museums. In places where the air moves slowly and the light changes gently throughout the day.
People visit them. Stand in front of them.
Take photos. Read small signs that try, very politely, to summarize thousands of years in a few sentences. And then they leave. The heads don't react. They don't acknowledge. They don't update their meaning based on who's looking. They just remain. And there's something quietly consistent about that. Let's drift into one last, very soft thought. We've spent all this time asking what they meant, who they represented, why they were made. And those are good questions. Natural ones. But maybe just for a moment, we can ask something simpler. What do they do now?
Not what they did then.
Not what they were intended to do, but what they do just by existing. They make people pause. Not dramatically. Not in a way that demands attention. Just a slight slowing. A moment where someone stands still and looks at something that has outlasted almost everything else around it. And in that moment, there's a shift. Very small, very quiet, but real. The present stretches a little. Time feels wider. And for a second, the rush of everything else softens. That's what they do now. Not as rulers, not as symbols of power, but as anchors. Points in the world where time feels different, where things don't need to change, where nothing is being asked of you except to notice, and then to move on when you're ready, which is exactly what we're doing here. No big ending, no final statement, just a gentle stopping point, the kind where the story doesn't really end. It just stops being told, and everything else continues quietly without it. So you can leave this here. No need to carry it further. The faces will still be there. They don't need remembering in the usual way. They're already doing what they've always done.
Sitting.
Waiting. Not for anything in particular. Just being. And somehow that's enough. Hey guys, we're still here. But only just. There's not much left to say. And that's not because something is missing, but because everything that needed to be said already settled into place. Quietly. The jungle hasn't changed. The air still feels warm, still heavy, still calm. And those stone faces, still exactly as they were. No movement, no shift, no sudden realization waiting at the end. Just presence. If you were to walk away now, nothing would follow you. No unanswered question pulling at your thoughts. No mystery demanding resolution. Just a soft awareness that something exists and doesn't need anything from you. And maybe that's the final, slightly unexpected part of all this. We spend so much time trying to understand things, to define them, to explain them completely. But not everything asks for that. Some things, especially the very old, very quiet ones, are perfectly fine without being fully understood. The Olmec heads are like that. They don't lose anything by our uncertainty. They don't become less because we don't have all the answers. They're not waiting for us to figure them out. They've already done their part. And now, they simply exist. Steady, unchanging, unconcerned. There's something almost reassuring about that. A reminder that not everything is fragile. Not everything depends on being seen, explained, or remembered correctly. Some things just endure. And in doing so, they create space. Space for curiosity, for reflection, for quiet moments like this one where nothing is urgent. Let's sit in that space for a second. No analysis, no interpretation, just stillness. Because that's been the rhythm of this whole journey. Not discovery, not excitement, just a slow, steady noticing. And now, even that can fade. There's no next part, no hidden layer waiting underneath. Just the same calm world, continuing exactly as it always has. So this is where we leave it. Not with a conclusion, not with a lesson, just with a feeling. Somewhere, far from here, those faces are still sitting in the earth, unbothered by time, uninterested in explanation, and completely at peace with both. You can let them stay there. They don't need anything else. And neither do you.
Good night.
Hey guys, we're still here. But only just. There's not much left to say. And that's not because something is missing, but because everything that needed to be said already settled into place. Quietly. The jungle hasn't changed. The air still feels warm, still heavy, still calm. And those stone faces, still exactly as they were. No movement, no shift, no sudden realization waiting at the end. Just presence. If you were to walk away now, nothing would follow you. No unanswered question pulling at your thoughts. No mystery demanding resolution. Just a soft awareness that something exists and doesn't need anything from you. And maybe that's the final, slightly unexpected part of all this. We spend so much time trying to understand things, to define them, to explain them completely. But not everything asks for that. Some things, especially the very old, very quiet ones, are perfectly fine without being fully understood. The Olmec heads are like that. They don't lose anything by our uncertainty. They don't become less because we don't have all the answers. They're not waiting for us to figure them out. They've already done their part. And now, they simply exist. Steady, unchanging, unconcerned. There's something almost reassuring about that. A reminder that not everything is fragile. Not everything depends on being seen, explained, or remembered correctly. Some things just endure. And in doing so, they create space. Space for curiosity, for reflection, for quiet moments like this one where nothing is urgent. Let's sit in that space for a second. No analysis, no interpretation, just stillness. Because that's been the rhythm of this whole journey. Not discovery, not excitement, just a slow, steady noticing. And now, even that can fade. There's no next part, no hidden layer waiting underneath. Just the same calm world, continuing exactly as it always has. So this is where we leave it. Not with a conclusion, not with a lesson, just with a feeling. Somewhere, far from here, those faces are still sitting in the earth, unbothered by time, uninterested in explanation, and completely at peace with both. You can let them stay there. They don't need anything else. And neither do you.
Good night.
Hey guys, just for a moment longer. We already said good night. And yet, here we are again. Not because there's more story to tell, but because sometimes the end doesn't arrive all at once. It lingers, softly, like when a conversation fades, but the feeling of it stays behind. So this is that feeling. Nothing new, nothing added, just the space after. If you imagine those Olmec heads now, you probably don't see every detail anymore. Not the exact shape of the eyes, not the precise curve of the lips,
Just the idea of them.
large, still,
Calm.
and that's enough. Because over time, details always soften. They fade into something simpler, something easier to hold. And maybe that's what's happened here too. We started with questions, with curiosity, with the quiet urge to understand something ancient and distant. And now, what's left isn't the questions. It's just the presence, a memory of stillness, a sense of something that doesn't move while everything else does. And that's not really about the Olmec anymore. It's about the feeling they leave behind. The kind that doesn't ask you to think harder, just to slow down. Because most of the time, we move quickly, from one thing to the next, one thought to another, always heading somewhere. But these faces, they don't go anywhere. And somehow, spending time with that idea changes the rhythm a little. Even after you've left, even now, there's no need to revisit the history. No need to remember dates or theories. Those can rest. What stays is quieter than that. Just the sense that something can exist without needing to explain itself, and that you can sit with it without needing to resolve it. That's all this ever was. Not a mystery to solve, not a story to finish, just a place to pause. And now, even that pause can end. No more parts after this. No continuation waiting quietly in the background. Just the world returning to its usual pace, but maybe just a little slower than before. So wherever you are, let things settle. Let the thoughts drift. And if, somewhere in your mind, those stone faces are still there, just sitting quietly, that's fine. They're good at that. And now, so are you. Good night.